Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple of different reasons. The first of which is just to take my brain out of the mode of background work out of the course of the week and move into the process of writing and preparing the sermon that I'll preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason I do these. And the second is just to allow you, the viewer who have come across this video for whatever reason has brought you here today, to gain some different insight in the assigned text for the week. So that is why I do these. As we are beginning this week, or looking at this week, which is December 2nd, 2018, this is the first Sunday of Advent, and so I have to say Happy New Year, kinda. If you caught me talking about Advent before, Advent is actually the start of the new church year. We don't quite line up in the church year with the calendar year. We're usually off by approximately a month, give or take a few days, just due to the way things go. Now, Advent is the 4 Sundays directly preceding Christmas Day. So whatever the 4 Sundays are right before the 25th, that's the 4 Sundays. Now, sometimes that kicks back into the last Sunday of November. Sometimes it's the first Sunday of December when it kicks off. It just kind of varies depending on how the calendar falls that year. A year ago, I don't know. A year ago was a year ago. It doesn't matter. But this Sunday is the first Sunday of Advent. And with that, we kick off a new church cycle. We are moving away from the Gospel of Mark, where we have been for the past year, and moving into the Gospel of Luke. They call this year C in the Revised Common Lectionary. But a little bit out of the ordinary this time is I'm actually not going to be preaching off the gospel this particular week. I'm going to preach from the Old Testament lesson. But before I do, just some thoughts on Advent itself. Now, Advent is typically thought of as a season of preparation as we prepare for the birth of Jesus at Christmas. But I'm kind of rethinking that traditional understanding just a little bit. Sometimes I think preparation isn't quite the right word, because preparation indicates that we have work to do, that we have stuff that we must do in order for that birth to happen. I read one commentary that I really kind of resonated with, this idea of that we are waiting, or that we are longing. And there's actually a Spanish word that I can't think of off the top of my head, but it's roughly translated as to long for. And this, I think, is perhaps more fitting, that we are longing for the coming Messiah. Now, something else that I'm thinking about too is the interesting way that Advent reminds us that we are between times and yet in time. Which sounded kind of philosophically weird. So we're waiting for an event that has already happened, and yet we're also waiting for a promise of a future event. And so we find ourselves waiting for the Messiah to come, or the presence of God as Jesus, who has already come and who is here now, through the presence of the Holy Spirit, and who is yet to come again in physical form in the last days, and whatever that's going to look like. And so we're in between times, and we acknowledge that in Advent, that it's not just about waiting for this baby to be born, because that event happened 2,000 plus years ago, but that it's about longing for the fulfillment of the promises which have been made. And that's kind of, I think, a good sensibility to be in. Now, my own personal history, oftentimes this first Sunday of Advent, I don't preach, either because if it happens to fall the Thanksgiving weekend back in November, I oftentimes end up taking that week off on vacation, and I don't preach. Or also sometimes on the flip side, as we get into this Christmas season, or this approaching Christmas season, the Christmas programs from choirs and Sunday school programs often kind of take over worship, and I end up not preaching. So I don't oftentimes end up preaching, as I've kind of mentioned, and so I haven't really encountered this particular first week of Advent much in terms of the 3-year cycle. I've gotten some of the other ones, but not necessarily this one. And so as I looked at the gospel, which comes out of Luke, it's Luke Luke 21 verses 25 through 36. Jesus is talking, and it sounds very end timesy, very end of days apocalyptic, revelatory type things, which in my mind I always associate with the end of the season of Pentecost, which we just wrapped up here within the last few weeks, and that type of teaching tends to happen there. Doesn't make me think Advent when I think of Jesus teaching about this is what will come and be prepared for that, be ready for that. So because of that, I did decide against the gospel. Yeah, we'll still share it in worship, but it's not what I'm going to preach on. I'm going to preach on the Old Testament lesson, which is very brief. It's Jeremiah 33 verses 14 through 16, Old Testament prophet. And this is very short passage. I'll just go ahead and read it, and then we'll talk some background. So Jeremiah 33, 14 through 16. The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will fulfill the promise that I made to the house of Israel and the house of Judah. In those days and at that time, I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In those days, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will live in safety. And this is the name by which it will be called, the Lord is our righteousness. All right, so that's the brief passage. So some history on Jeremiah. As I mentioned, Old Testament prophet. Some of the things that I've read kind of indicate that he was from the northern kingdom of Israel or Samaria, though that area, although that kingdom didn't really exist anymore, it had already been destroyed and conquered and taken over by in the Assyrian exile, or the Assyrian conquering, which happened in about the year 720 BCE ish. That date is a little fuzzy for me, but that he was either from there or he was just from the area around the northern part of the southern kingdom of Judah that still existed at this time. And he was active in the years leading up to the Babylonian conquering and the Babylonian exile. In fact, much of his writings are aimed at that way. These prophetic words from God that call to the destruction of the nation and the city because of what is coming, because of their unfaithfulness to God. Now, it's thought that based on a lot of what's going on, and especially the section kind of right around this here in chapter 33, is happening right about the turn of the century, which the first Babylonian takeover happened in 598 BCE, so right after the year 600 BC, about 600 years before Jesus. And historically, what we see happening is that the Babylonians came in. They were the superpower of the day. They had taken over the Assyrians and destroyed the Assyrian Empire. And they came in and pretty much took over the southern kingdom of Judah and hauled the king off into exile, and then appointed his uncle to be king. And it was a vassal state type thing of we'll let you still be, but you're going to pay us tribute, and you better not rise up against us. And then about 10, 11, 12 years later, they kind of rebelled and tried to free themselves of Babylonian rule. And that's when the Babylonians came in and destroyed Jerusalem, pretty much hauled everybody off into exile, and destroyed the temple, and all of that was kind of the result. Jeremiah talks about all of this and was active. He was actually imprisoned at the time that some of this was going on, because the powers that be within the nation weren't real happy with this prediction that he was making. So they threw him in jail, which might have gained him a little bit of favor when the Babylonians came in. It's like, oh, you're a political prisoner? Well, maybe we like you. So he remained there. But then it's thought when the final destruction was coming in the second go around, that he was taken, perhaps against his will, but off into Egypt, where many people fled for the purpose of safety, to avoid being controlled or taken over or taken prisoner or even killed by the Babylonians. So that is kind of where things are happening in terms of the history. But what's important to think about, and especially as we consider this brief passage, is the reminder of the promise that God has made. and that even in the midst of this prophecy that destruction is coming and that the city will be destroyed and that the roads will be empty and the land will be empty, that will not be the end. That God has promised, even in the midst of that turmoil, even in the midst of that suffering that will come, that is coming, that that there is hope beyond it. That's really what this kind of aims at. Now, some different thoughts. So we have that promise of God that they're reminded of. Now, what's this whole righteous branch bringing up for David? There's the promise made to David, that God makes to David, that one of your line will always be on the throne. And if we look back through the history, from David's line, that is roughly the year 1000 BC. It's slightly after that, but it's kind of in that range. All the way through the divided or the United Kingdom initially, that started with King Saul, and then David expanded, and then Solomon after. And then after Solomon's kid Rehoboam, that's when the kingdom became divided, and they just ruled over Judah, the southern tribes, and then all the way until this Babylonian captivity that I talked about a little bit ago. We can trace the line connected all the way down from David, I believe. From what I've seen, yes, it is that they were still of David's line, and then though, when the captivity happens, that line is, of course, broken. And but the promise is that God will raise up a righteous branch. Now, there's the imagery of the tree of David's line being cut down, and pardon me, I got white in my nose here. And leaving the stump behind, and then all of a sudden, this new branch, this new sprout, comes up. That's actually a little bit closer translation than branch, is a sprout. And if you've ever seen, we call them suckers that come up off the base of a tree. But if you've ever seen that come up, you know how hard it is to kill the root, especially of a large tree. And so this can happen, that you'll see this new sprout come up. But the idea of righteousness, that's what's really catching my attention. In fact, I had a conversation within a Bible study here in my congregation this week about that. What does righteous mean? Now, the idea of righteousness or justice comes from the Hebrew word sadak. It's hard to pronounce. Tzedakah, I think. I'm probably slaughtering that. My Hebrew is not the strongest, but we talked about what is this idea of righteousness, and it seems to aim at the justice that comes from God, the justice that God directs within our lives. Well, what does that mean? Well, that can mean a lot of things. Maybe it aims at the Ten Commandments. Maybe it aims at the law. Maybe it aims at the idea, and I'm coming forward into the New Testament now, but when Jesus is asked, what's the most important commandment? He says, love God and love your neighbor. The law and the prophets all hang upon this. So what does that mean? Well, probably going to mean a lot of different things. And are we going to pull it off perfectly? Of course not. But that seems to be what this idea of righteousness, that we are called righteous. We don't call ourselves righteous. We don't name ourselves that, but that righteousness comes down from God, and is dictated by God, or is understood by God. I don't know exactly how to say it, but that's important to think about. Now, some other things that are going on in this brief passage. If we think about the fact that the Davidic line, the Davidic dynasty, if we want to call it that, had some issues. David was loved by God, sought after God, and yet David had his own problems, and we know that. And then Solomon, interestingly enough, built the temple for God. Built this glorious place, and he used slave labor to do it. The God who freed this people from slavery, clear back in Exodus in the get-go, is honored through slave labor issue. And then we actually hear about it then with Rehoboam, as the kingdom is divided. When he becomes king, he's given a choice. The people say, your father treated us harshly, but if you treat us well, we will serve you. And in turn, he decides, nope, I'm going to treat you even harsher than my dad did, and you fail. And so We also then hear about many of the kings that came in the lines after struggled and led the people astray. So this dynasty has problems, does not bring about the justice of God or the righteousness of God. And yet God says in this promise, I will raise up this sprout for David, or this branch for David, who will execute justice and righteousness, and will do the things that these previous kings have failed to do. This one will do it. And we also hear about, in those days Judah will be saved, Jerusalem will live in safety, and this is the name that it will be called, the Lord is our righteousness. So the righteousness we see comes from God, and it's right there in the name. Now, one thought on that, name change. If you're familiar with the changing of names within the scriptures, it's usually quite significant, and especially in the Hebrew language and the Hebrew understanding, names typically meant something very, very specific. And so to call this city, the Lord is our righteous, to change the name, how is that possible? Well, it's possible only through God. God institutes it. And how is it possible that this flawed dynasty of flawed, broken people, God will raise up a branch who will execute God's justice and God's righteousness, whatever that means? Clearly, this means that there's something new going on. There's something significant, a significant change. Now, who is this branch of David's line? Well, we tend to think that this is aimed at Jesus. Now, Jesus was of the line of David. We learn that in Luke's gospel. But could it also be aimed at someone else? Maybe. The original prophecy that happens back in 2 Samuel that is spoken to David and seems to indicate his direct descendants, that being Solomon, possibly Rehoboam. But they are flawed, as we know, as we already talked about. So is this talking about Jesus? And I think the answer to that is both yes and no. I think that the prophecy itself is directed at something else, and yet we can view these prophecies through what they call a Christological lens, which is a really big fancy way of saying through the lens of Jesus, which is how we tend to see things. Now, that being said, sometimes I get a little hesitant to hijack the Hebrew scriptures through the lens of Christ, and yet through the power of the Holy Spirit, whatever we want to say it, that affects how we see things. That affects how I do anyway, how I interpret things. And so that's why I say this, is it about Jesus? Both yes and no. So long story short, because I've gotten really long-winded here, as we think about this brief passage, this brief reminder of the promise that even in the midst of turmoil, which is coming, even in the midst of the issues that they will face when they are in exile, and knowing that those carried off into exile are going to die there, that they will not live to come back again. That a couple of generations go by before that's going to happen. That this restoration will happen. It is promised that there is more to come. That the present circumstances are not the final word, and that's a promise that I think is important as we come back around to this idea of Advent, as we're kicking off the season of Advent, this season of longing, the longing for the fulfillment of the promises, the longing for the return of the one who has already come and who will come again. This strange sensibility that we feel here now in the season of Advent, and even within our present reality, that we acknowledge that the kingdom of heaven is both now and not yet. And what's that mean? Well, I don't know, but we long for the fulfillment, and yet we act in a way of its reality now. And so it's all tied together. If you have thoughts, questions, comments, by all means, throw them down in the comment section. We will continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week. Just a heads up, the next 2 weeks, I will probably still be producing videos. They may be a little more brief and a little more off the top of my head, because like I mentioned before, it's now Christmas program season, so I won't be preaching the next 2 weeks, but I will probably still do videos anyway. Have a great week. We'll catch you next time.